Welcome back to Faith Roots and to another walk and talk. And we'll continue to think about pastoral care and counselling. Today we're going to talk a bit more about why we do pastoral care and counselling. What is our aim? What is our purpose? What's our goal? And we're going to do that. Really doing sort of three things here. First, we're going to think about what is it that gets people to come and talk to us. What's the trigger point, the contact point that creates a pastoral counselling relationship? Secondly, we're going to do a bit of big, wider theological thinking about why there is a need for pastoral counselling. And thirdly, we are going to look at some specific scripture. So, first of all, why do people come to us? And there tend to be two main triggers. There's a positive, a proactive one, and that's when someone comes and says, here's something that's happening or going to happen in my life, a life event, or here's a decision that I've got to make and I'd like some help with it. And so we get involved. Now that might be, for example, that they are about to get married, and so in the run-up to the marriage, you do a little marriage course with them. You meet with a couple every week and you work through particular issues, particular aspects of what married life is going to be like. And that's a form of pastoral counselling, whether you work through a book together or whether you use your own materials. Or somebody says, I've got to make a decision about a job or which course to take, or whether or not to go for promotion. And again, they might look for some advice. What do you advise me to do as an elder or pastor in the church or church leader? It might be ongoing life circumstances. It might be them looking for advice and help with parenting. And in that sense, those are positive, proactive moves as somebody looks for help in advance of issues coming up. How do I make this decision? How do I do the right thing? How do I get the best out of this? Secondly, the more reactive situation is when somebody comes and they are struggling with something. When they've had an experience, when something has happened to them, when they've got an ongoing difficulty. So it could be somebody saying, I'm struggling with an addiction. It could be someone who is saying that I'm experiencing the effects of trauma. It could be somebody coming to say, I'm struggling with my emotional health, with depression. It could be that they come and say, my marriage has fallen apart. And it can be that somebody comes and says, I've been really convicted about this particular area of sin and temptation in my life. And I want to be free from it. And sometimes the starting point could be where there's where there's evidence of demonic activity in a community, in a family, in a person. And it's worth saying, just as a side point, that even if you are in a situation where the person is then released from demonic oppression, if demons are cast out, I would say that it is still important to then follow up with some pastoral care and counselling to understand a bit more about how they got into that circumstance and how they make sure that they don't slide back into it. But what we're seeing is that people are likely to be coming to us, or we're likely to have the opportunity to speak into their lives because they want to know how to cope with the reality of life in this world as it is, and particularly with life in a fallen world, with life in a world where there is suffering. And that's where I wanted to take us in terms of theology, because it is helpful for us to have a right understanding and a right expectation about what it means for Christians to live in this world. Now, so big picture. God created this good and beautiful creation, this wonderful world around us. And God saw that it was good. And he placed us as human beings in this creation, made in his image, to worship him, but also to look after this creation, to be his ambassadors, his representatives, his image bearers here. And so Adam and Eve, the first human beings, were told to fill and subdue the earth. God's people made to live in his presence, in his place, under his protection and provision, under his rule and blessing, and to be those that ruled and blessed and provided and protected and nurtured as well. And that means that God has given us everything that we need to live in this world. He gives people, as time goes on, he gives them all that they need for each stage of history. And so God's people, Israel, they are given commands that are telling them how to live in the land, in the world that God has given to them. But Adam and Eve, right back at the start, Adam and Eve tried to rival God, want to make their own decisions, refuse to obey the rules, the good rules that God has given, breach the boundaries. That's all summed up in the taking of the fruit. They desire something that is wrong for them at that time, and they seek even things that are good, but at the wrong time and in the wrong way. Adam and Eve fall. Death comes into the world. And death is about being exiled from God's loving presence, about the break of covenant relationship. Death is about decay coming in, and with that means that there is physical death, there's physical suffering as well in a fallen world that no longer just simply reacts and responds as it was intended to power, gentle nurture and care. Work becomes hard. Even childbirth becomes painful and dangerous. And that's the world that we live in. With so much evidence still of God's goodness in it, but also a world that Romans 8 describes as longing and groaning for a future day, the revelation of the sons of glory. As I said, God calls a people, Israel, to be his people, to live in his place, in his land, a kind of God's world in miniature, and gives them a covenant, a relationship with them. But they fail to obey. They, like Adam, disobey and seek to rival God and to bring in their own gods. And the result is a form of death, experienced as exile. But God's true Son is Jesus, the obedient Son. And Jesus lives a perfect, obedient life, dies in our place, and rises, bringing new life, new creation. And what that means is that we live in a world now where redemption has come, but we await a final day when Jesus will return to put all things right, to make all things new again. And so we talk about living in a now and not yet world. That now Jesus has come, now Jesus has dealt with sin, but not yet do we see the final consummation and the full extent of his rule and reign. And that means that believers live in a world that is still under judgment, that is still subject to decay, and where suffering still happens. And we should expect that. And that's important. When we think about the need for pastoral care and pastoral counselling, because if Jesus hadn't come, if we didn't have the now bit, then there would be a futility to any attempt by us to get involved in people's lives. It would be a waste of time. There would be no hope. But if everything was completely put right, then there wouldn't be a need for pastoral counselling and care, because people wouldn't experience suffering. And like I said, that's where it's important to get our theology, our underpinning right. Because there are some people who act as though Christians don't have to go through difficulty or suffering or any of those kinds of things. We often think of this as prosperity gospel teaching, or an overreached eschatology, or health and wealth and prosperity. And in that kind of world, two things happen. First of all, you got to make any decision in your life, that's fine. God will tell you, he will give you a dream, a vision, a word in your head, an out loud word, draw your attention to a verse from the Bible, and you will know exactly what to do. Now, I speak as someone who believes in the gifts of the Spirit, including prophecy, including words of knowledge and words of wisdom, including dreams and visions and all those sorts of things, and we see them in our own church and we've experienced them in our own lives. But what I've also seen, and what I would argue we see as we look at Scripture, is this: that whilst those things are there, we shouldn't assume that God is always going to deal with us in that kind of spectacular kind of way. That actually there's an encouragement to live our lives like as grown-ups in this world where we are learning to use wisdom, which God gives us in Scripture, to think things through and to make decisions for ourselves. Also, because when we think about how God does speak to us, we distinguish between special revelation and general revelation. Special revelation is basically the Bible. It's where God reveals clearly, without error, without mistake, authoritatively and sufficiently, all that we need to know for salvation. It's like all we need to know to live godly lives. It's sufficient. But Scripture doesn't give us every detail for every circumstance. Again, because there's that expectation that we will use wisdom, that we will learn, that we will train ourselves to be godly. We'll come back to that shortly. The other type of revelation is called general revelation, and that's the fact that God is always revealing things about his character and his will and his purpose in all that he does. Creation itself is an act of revelation. God's providential care through history reveals something about him and his purposes. But because it's not Scripture, it doesn't have that same clarity and authority. Not because God likes clarity and authority, but because of our fallen nature, our ability to read things. I often use the illustration to say it's a bit like me with my glasses off. I can see things, but they are out of focus. My father, if he was to take his hearing aids out, he can still hear things, but it lacks that clarity. And my glasses, I've often said, are like Scripture, like special revelation. They enable me to see clearly. So they're not just the thing that I look at themselves, but they're actually the thing that I look through. And this has implications for dreams, prophecies, all those kinds of things. That if they are really part of that general revelation, then we are not going to give them the same weight that we do Scripture. There's not going to be the same clarity and sharpness. I'm not going to say that this is infallible, inerrant. Again, not because we are diminishing who God is, but because we are recognizing our own weakness. And so pastoral care and counselling from that angle is about helping people using the right lens, using Scripture, to make wise decisions. Because they're going to need help interpreting what they are seeing and hearing correctly. The second danger with a faulty worldview, a faulty theology, is this, that we have this kind of prosperity kind of idea that says you're not meant to suffer if you're a Christian. And therefore, if you are suffering, what you need to do is just recognise that that's been caused by your sin and your lack of faith. To have enough faith and to denounce and tell that suffering, that sickness, that pain to be gone. Now, there is nowhere in Scripture that suggests that Christians will live free from suffering, free from pain, free from death until Jesus comes back. And again, I say that as someone who believes in and has witnessed God at work, answering prayers, bringing healing in specific situations, giving us that foretaste of the great day to come. And that's fantastic, and maybe we should expect more of it than we see. But I would still say that the normal Christian life will involve suffering. And that's where we get to Scripture. Two big Bible verses for us. 2 Timothy 3 verse 12. Now the context here is that 2 Timothy 3 verse 12 is leading up to the verse 16 that says all scripture is God breathed and is sufficient for teaching and correction. It's what we need. But before that, Paul gives a bit of autobiographical detail. He talks about his own life. He shares some testimony, and then he says, in fact, this is verse 12 from memory, all who seek to live a godly life will face persecution. That if you are seeking to live for Jesus, then your experience is going to include suffering. And that suffering is not just going to be about living in a fallen world. It means that actually people are going to deliberately seek your harm. Because, and we know this from the Jesus' Beatitudes in his Sermon on the Mount, that we should expect to receive the same treatment that Jesus faced. So we will face persecution, we will also experience suffering. And so Romans 5 verse 1 to 3, it talks about us being justified and having peace with God, then talks about suffering. And says that we shouldn't look down on suffering because God uses suffering. Suffering produces perseverance. I can't remember every single bit along the way, but eventually it leads up to saying that it produces a hope that doesn't disappoint. That God works through our suffering. And this takes us to what our aim, what our purpose should be. We're meant to train ourselves to be godly. This is the specific scriptures we're coming to. We expect to experience suffering, but we also know that God will use suffering for good. So I want to suggest that there are 2 things that we want to do with pastoral care and pastoral counselling. The first thing is to help the person being counselled see what God is doing in their lives, through their experiences, through their circumstances. And secondly, our aim is to help them to be godly. Or as Mike Ovey put it, we don't just want you to survive your circumstances, survive your suffering. We want you to be holy, to be godly in them, to grow through them. And that is what makes Christian counselling, biblical counselling, pastoral counselling through the church different to secular therapy. And even different to how sometimes we think of our approach to counselling. Because it is more than just offering comfort to alleviate suffering. There's an element of that to it. But it's more than that. And in fact, pastoral counselling can be fruitful, can achieve its goal, even if the suffering remains. Pastoral counselling, if it's proactive, can be good and fruitful, even if we're not able to help a person make a decision that seems to work out. Provided it does the job it's meant to do, and it helps them to be holy and godly. So, for example, if someone comes and talks to me about a big decision they've got to make. Should I move home? Should I get a different job? Should I go for that promotion? Then what they need to hear from me is not just advice on how to get that promotion, or which job to go for or what house to look at. And certainly not advice on whether or not they will be successful, whether or not that's in itself a good and right decision. 9 times out of 10, there isn't a right or wrong decision to be made, providing that there isn't a sinful one. But my concern should be to help them think through, how do I make this decision in a godly way, and how do I use the circumstances, my experiences, I make the decision and I go through the consequences of my decision. How do I respond to the consequences in a way that enables me to grow in my faith in Jesus? Similarly with suffering. I can offer advice about how to alleviate the pain and suffering of depression and the pain and suffering of grief. I can't take away that pain. But again, more importantly, I can help you to see how you can continue to be holy and live for Christ even with depression, even in your grief. So in future walk and talks, we're going to be thinking a bit more about the practicalities of counselling, the sorts of things that we might look at, how we would approach it. Thank you for listening in.